February 1944. A stone-walled interrogation room somewhere in Germany. The American pilot sits on a wooden chair. His flight suit is torn. His hands are bound. Guards stand at the door. The war, for him, is supposed to be over. Robert Hoover has been processed, questioned, catalogued. He is now a number in a German prison system designed to hold men until the war ends or they break. But the Germans have made one miscalculation. They assume he has stopped thinking. The logic of captivity is simple and absolute. A prisoner has no aircraft, no weapons, no radio, no unit. He exists in a controlled environment where every door is locked, every perimeter is watched, and every attempt at resistance is met with immediate consequence. The rational response is compliance. Wait for the war to end. Survive. Robert Hoover understood this logic perfectly. He had seen the fences. He had counted the guards. He had measured the distances between buildings, noted the patrol schedules, observed the routines of men who had been doing this work for years. The mathematics of escape were brutal. Even if a prisoner slipped past the first barrier, he faced hundreds of miles of enemy territory. No papers, no language fluency, no civilian clothes, no food supply, no contact with resistance networks, no knowledge of safe routes. The Germans knew these numbers, too. They had built their prison system around them. Stalag Luft I, where Hoover would eventually be held, was designed specifically for captured Allied airmen. The compound sat on a peninsula jutting into the Baltic Sea near Barth, Germany. The geography itself was a prison. Water on 3 sides, flat, open terrain on the 4th. Guard towers with clear sight lines, multiple fence lines. Roll calls conducted with methodical precision. The men who ran these camps understood pilots. Aviators were considered high-value prisoners. They possessed technical knowledge about aircraft performance, formation tactics, target priorities, and equipment capabilities. The Luftwaffe interrogation system was designed to extract this information systematically, starting with isolation and psychological pressure, then moving through increasingly sophisticated questioning techniques. But beyond intelligence extraction, the camps served a simpler purpose. They removed pilots from the war. Every American airman behind wire was one fewer man in a cockpit over Germany. The strategic calculus was clear. A pilot took years to train. His aircraft cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. His combat experience was irreplaceable. Capturing him intact was worth more than killing him. So the Germans fed their prisoners, gave them barracks, allowed limited recreation, followed Geneva Convention protocols closely enough to maintain order. The goal was not cruelty for its own sake. The goal was containment, and containment worked. The vast majority of Allied airmen who entered the German prison system stayed there until liberation. Not because they lacked courage, because they understood the odds. Escape attempts that failed meant punishment, injury, or death. Escape attempts that succeeded required resources, planning, timing, and luck that few men possessed. Robert Hoover sat in that system and absorbed its logic completely. He also rejected it. Not through defiance or bravado, through something quieter. He simply refused to accept that the situation was final. He watched, he listened, he catalogued, he waited for the seam in the system that every system eventually reveals. The Germans saw a compliant prisoner following rules. They did not see the pilot still flying in his mind. If this history matters to you, tap like and subscribe. Robert Anderson Hoover was born on January 24, 1922, in Nashville, Tennessee. He grew up in the Depression years, when money was scarce and certainty was scarcer. His family was working class. His future was not predetermined. There was no dynasty of pilots behind him, no inherited wealth to purchase flight time, no connections to military aviation circles. What he had was obsession. From his earliest memories, Hoover was drawn to aircraft. He built model planes. He haunted local airfields. He worked odd jobs to accumulate the small amounts of money required for brief flights with barnstormers who passed through Tennessee. Every minute in the air confirmed what he already knew about himself. Flying was not something he wanted to do. It was something he was. By 16, he had logged his first solo flight. Not through formal instruction, through persistence, charm, and the willingness of local pilots to let a kid who clearly belonged in a cockpit prove himself. He learned in fabric-covered trainers, single-engine machines that responded to every input with immediate consequence. Sloppy stick work meant sloppy flight. Precise control meant smooth air. Hoover developed precision. He also developed something harder to teach: spatial awareness, the ability to feel where an aircraft was in three-dimensional space without constant reference to instruments, to sense the relationship between airspeed, angle of attack, and energy state through subtle pressure on the controls and the sound of wind over surfaces. This was not learned from manuals. It came from hours of experimentation, pushing aircraft to their edges and feeling what happened at the boundaries. Hoover was not reckless. He was curious. He wanted to understand what machines could actually do, not just what they were supposed to do. When war came, he was ready. He enlisted in the Army Air Forces in 1940, before Pearl Harbor. His civilian flying experience accelerated his progress through training. He excelled in primary, basic, and advanced instruction. His instructors noted his unusual control sensitivity and his calm under pressure. He was assigned to fighters. The aircraft he would fly in combat was the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. The P-38 was unlike any other American fighter of its era. Twin engines mounted on twin booms, a central nacelle housing the pilot and concentrated armament, counter-rotating propellers that eliminated torque effects, tricycle landing gear that improved ground handling, a distinctive silhouette that was instantly recognizable from any angle. It was also demanding. The P-38 required pilots who could manage asymmetric thrust, complex engine controls, and the unique aerodynamic characteristics of a twin-boom configuration. Engine failure on one side created immediate yaw toward the dead engine. Recovery required instant, correct response. The wrong input meant a spin. A spin at low altitude meant death. Hoover learned the Lightning's secrets. He flew training missions that pushed the aircraft through its entire performance envelope. He practiced single-engine procedures until they became reflex. He studied the systems: turbochargers, intercoolers, fuel management, electrical redundancies, until he could troubleshoot failures while maintaining combat awareness. He was assigned to the 52nd Fighter Group, operating in the Mediterranean and European theaters. His missions were long-range escort and ground attack, deep penetrations into enemy airspace, hours of flight over hostile territory where mechanical failure or combat damage meant no friendly field within reach. The P-38's range was an asset. Its vulnerability, when damaged, was a constant reality. Hoover flew these missions with the understanding that every flight could end in capture or death. He flew them anyway. By early 1944, he had accumulated combat experience that taught him lessons no training could provide. He had seen aircraft disintegrate around him. He had watched friends fail to return. He had felt the particular loneliness of flight over enemy territory, where the radio crackled with distant voices and the sky held threats invisible until they became fatal. He had also learned something about himself. Under pressure, his mind did not freeze. It accelerated. When systems failed or enemies appeared or plans collapsed, Hoover found that his thinking became clearer, not cloudier. The urgency compressed everything to essentials. What mattered now? What could be controlled? What action was available in the next 3 seconds? This was not fearlessness. Fear was present. It simply did not govern. The Germans would capture a pilot who looked like all the others. They would not understand what they were holding. The mission that ended in capture began like dozens before it. February 9th, 1944, southern France. A fighter sweep over enemy territory, looking for targets of opportunity and protecting American bombers on their runs deep into Axis-controlled Europe. Hoover was flying his P-38 as part of a formation. The weather was typical for winter operations: broken clouds, variable visibility, the kind of sky that could hide threats until they were already on top of you. The details of what happened next exist in fragments. What is certain is that his aircraft was hit. Whether by ground fire or enemy fighters, the result was the same: damage to critical systems, loss of control authority. The lightning that had carried him through combat became a machine trying to kill him. The P-38's twin-engine configuration was both salvation and curse in moments like this. If one engine failed cleanly, a skilled pilot could maintain flight on the other. But if damage affected flight controls, fuel systems, or structural integrity, the aircraft's complexity became a liability. More systems meant more things that could fail catastrophically. Hoover fought the aircraft as it descended. He would have run through emergency procedures automatically, checking systems, attempting restart protocols, adjusting trim, looking for options. Somewhere below was enemy territory. Somewhere above was safety that was now unreachable. The mathematics were simple and terrible. He was going down. A P-38 crash landing was survivable if the pilot maintained control until the final moment. The tricycle gear configuration actually helped in forced landings on unimproved surfaces. The central nacelle protected the pilot better than some single-engine designs. But everything depended on finding terrain that would accept an aircraft arriving at high speed with limited control. Hoover brought the lightning down. Whether the landing was controlled or semi-controlled, whether he walked away clean or crawled away, injured, the outcome was the same. He was on the ground in occupied France. His aircraft was destroyed or disabled. He was alone. The immediate hours after a shootdown were critical. Escape and evasion doctrine was clear. Move away from the crash site. Avoid roads and populated areas. Seek contact with resistance networks if possible. Travel by night. Hide by day. Work toward neutral territory or known Allied positions. The reality was more complicated. Hoover was in winter. Food was scarce. Papers were required for movement. The German occupation was thorough and alert. Informants were everywhere. The local population faced severe penalties for aiding downed airmen. He evaded for some period. The exact duration is not precisely recorded. What matters is that eventually, despite his efforts, German forces found him. He was captured, processed, identified as a USAAF fighter pilot. The war in the sky was over for him. The war in his mind was not. He was moved into the German prisoner system. Interrogation came first. The Luftwaffe ran sophisticated intelligence operations at centers like Stalag Luft near Frankfurt. New prisoners were isolated, questioned, and psychologically pressured to reveal information about units, tactics, and targets. Standard procedure. Hoover would have experienced the pattern that thousands of Allied airmen experienced, the initial chaos of capture giving way to the numbing routine of imprisonment, the transfer to permanent camp, the assignment to barracks, the first roll call, the first encounter with the fence that would define his horizon. Stalag Luft. I was not the worst prison in the German system. It was not designed to kill. It was designed to hold. But for a man like Robert Hoover, holding was its own form of death. He had spent his life moving, training, flying. The confinement was physical, but the deeper wound was the removal from his purpose. He was a pilot without an aircraft, a weapon without a war. Other men accepted this, found ways to occupy time, read, played cards, organized camp activities, waited. Hoover waited too. But his waiting was different. It was active, observational, strategic. He was looking for the seam. The German guards at Stalag Luft. I had seen thousands of prisoners. They understood the psychology of captured airmen. They knew that pilots, in particular, carried a certain self-image, independence, competence, the belief in their own capability. Initial captivity often broke this image through systematic demonstration of powerlessness. The first weeks were the hardest. New prisoners arrived shocked, sometimes injured, always disoriented. They had gone from the controlled chaos of aerial combat to the absolute control of imprisonment in a matter of hours. The transition was jarring. Identity had to be reconstructed around a new reality. Most prisoners eventually accepted, not surrender in a moral sense, acceptance in a practical sense, the recognition that their circumstances were fixed until external forces changed them. The war would end. Liberation would come. The task was to survive until then. The camp administration counted on this pattern. They maintained order through routine, not brutality, roll calls at fixed times, meals at fixed times, recreation periods at fixed times. The rhythm of camp life became hypnotic. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months. Guards watched for the initial resistance phase to pass. They expected restlessness in the first weeks. Some prisoners would test boundaries, probe defenses, make noise about escape. Then they would settle. The guards knew the odds as well as the prisoners did. Escape from a properly run camp was extraordinarily difficult. Escape from occupied Europe was nearly impossible. The few who tried and failed served as examples for the rest. Robert Hoover appeared to follow this pattern. He followed rules, attended roll calls, kept his head down, did not draw attention, participated in the camp activities that helped men maintain sanity, physical exercise, educational lectures organized by prisoners, the small social structures that formed in the barracks. To casual observation, he was another pilot, waiting out the war. The guards catalogued him as such: a name, a rank, a serial number, a face among hundreds of faces, compliant, contained, controlled. What they did not see was the map forming in his mind. Hoover watched the guards' patterns. Which ones were alert? Which ones were bored? Which ones drank? Which ones could be distracted? He noted shift changes, rotation schedules, the moments when attention wavered. He studied the physical plant, the fence construction, the spacing of towers, the sight lines, the dead zones where observation was incomplete, the areas where buildings blocked views. He listened to other prisoners. Some had been there longer. They had accumulated knowledge through trial and error, through the failures of earlier escape attempts that revealed the system's strengths and weaknesses. Hoover absorbed this information without appearing to seek it. He was building an operational picture, not a fantasy of escape. A realistic assessment of possibilities. He understood that most escape attempts failed because they were romantic rather than methodical. Men acted on frustration rather than calculation. He would not make that mistake. The question was not whether escape was possible. The question was whether it was possible for him, with the resources available, at a moment that aligned his capabilities with a gap in the system. He waited for that moment with the patience of a pilot circling for the right approach. The Germans assumed he had given up. They assumed wrong. The moment came not through dramatic circumstance, but through the accumulation of small opportunities. Spring 1945. The war was grinding toward its conclusion. The German military situation was deteriorating on all fronts. Resources were strained. Routines that had been rigid were becoming frayed. Guards who had been alert were becoming distracted. The system was developing seams. Hoover had been watching for over a year. He had refined his understanding of the camp's vulnerabilities. He knew which sections of perimeter were most vulnerable. He knew the timing windows when movement was least observed. He had identified the moments when chaos was most likely. What he had not known was when the larger situation would create the final necessary conditions. The advance of Allied forces from both east and west created that condition. As the Third Reich collapsed, prison camp administration became increasingly chaotic. Orders came and were countermanded. Guards were pulled for combat duty. Supply chains failed. The certainty that had maintained control was dissolving. Hoover recognized the opportunity. The exact details of his escape are not fully documented in the historical record. What is known is that in the final chaotic days of the camp's existence, he made his move. He did not wait for liberation. He did not wait for the gates to be opened by advancing forces. He acted before the ending was certain. This decision, to move before safety was guaranteed, revealed the core of who he was. He was not merely a prisoner waiting for rescue. He was a pilot who had been temporarily grounded, waiting for his moment to return to the air. The escape itself would have required everything he had learned: the patience to wait for the exact right moment, the discipline to move when every instinct screamed for caution, the physical capability to cover ground in hostile territory. And then came the element that separated Hoover's story from those of other escapees. He found an aircraft. In the chaos of Germany's collapse, Luftwaffe bases were being abandoned. Aircraft were being destroyed to prevent capture. Equipment was being left behind. In this disorder, a Focke-Wulf Fw 190, one of Germany's premier fighters, sat available to anyone with the knowledge and audacity to take it. Hoover had the knowledge. He approached an enemy aircraft he had never flown, studied the cockpit layout, identified the essential controls, and made a decision that defied every rational calculation. He would fly it out. The Fw 190 was a radial engine fighter with handling characteristics entirely different from the P-38 he knew. German instruments, German labeling, German systems. He had no manual, no instruction, no practice. He had instinct and desperation and the fundamental truth that an aircraft was an aircraft. He found the starter, he found the throttle, he found the controls. The engine caught. In that moment, the German prison system's most basic assumption collapsed. They had assumed that a captured pilot, separated from his aircraft, was neutralized. They had not considered that a pilot capable enough could acquire a new aircraft. The Fw 190's engine settled into rough idle. Hoover sat in a cockpit designed for a pilot who spoke German, trained on German systems, fought for the Reich. Every gauge was unfamiliar. Every label was in a language he could not read. The control positions were similar to what he knew, but not identical. He had seconds to make decisions that should have taken weeks of training. Throttle forward. The aircraft began to move. He taxied toward whatever passed for a runway, working the unfamiliar controls, feeling the aircraft's responses, building the mental model that experienced pilots construct automatically, but that he was creating in real time under impossible pressure. Takeoff in an unfamiliar fighter was not simply dangerous. It was a calculated gamble against physics. Every aircraft has its own rotation speed, its own climb characteristics, its own critical quirks. Get it wrong and the aircraft stalls, spins, or simply fails to fly. Hoover got it right. The FW-190 lifted from German soil with an American pilot at the controls. He was airborne. But airborne was only the first problem. He was now flying an enemy aircraft through airspace where both German air defenses and Allied fighters were actively hunting. To the Germans, he was a stolen asset, reason enough to shoot. To the Allies, he was an enemy aircraft, reason enough to shoot. The identification problem was immediate and possibly fatal. Hoover flew toward Allied lines with full understanding that the aircraft he was in could get him killed by his own side. Recognition protocols existed for good reason. An FW-190 appearing over Allied positions would draw fire first, and questions never. He had to get low. He had to get visible. He had to hope that someone on the ground would notice something strange about this particular enemy fighter before opening fire. The approach to Allied territory required nerve and luck in equal measure. Nerve he had. Luck was uncertain. He crossed the lines. Whether he was fired upon, how close the calls were, what exactly transpired in those final minutes. The details exist in varying accounts. What is certain is that he landed the aircraft on Allied-controlled territory. He had escaped. He had escaped in an enemy fighter. He had escaped in an enemy fighter he had never flown before. The immediate consequences rippled outward. Intelligence officers were intensely interested in a pilot who could provide first-hand accounts of German prison camp operations and, more remarkably, first-hand experience with the FW-190's flight characteristics. Hoover's impromptu familiarity with the aircraft, however brief, provided data points about enemy equipment that formal capture and analysis would have taken longer to acquire. More fundamentally, his escape represented something the system was not designed to produce. Prisoners were supposed to stay captured. That was the entire point. Every hour a pilot spent behind wire was an hour he was not flying combat missions. The investment in capture and containment was predicated on the assumption that it would hold. Hoover broke that assumption. Not through brute force or external rescue, but through the accumulation of attention, patience, and opportunity. He had watched the system until he understood it. He had waited until the system weakened. He had acted when the moment arrived, and when he needed an aircraft, he found one. The German guards who had catalogued him as another compliant prisoner had fundamentally misjudged what they were containing. They had captured a body. They had not captured a pilot. The war in Europe ended weeks later. Hoover's escape was one small story in the vast tapestry of the conflict's conclusion. But it was his story, his choice, his flight. He had found his way back to the sky. After the war, Robert Hoover went home to Tennessee. The mechanisms of peace absorbed him as they absorbed millions. Discharge papers, civilian clothes, the strange quiet of streets where no one was shooting and no one was hunting. He could have stopped. Many men did. The war had given them enough flying for a lifetime. They returned to farms, offices, factories. They put the sky behind them. Hoover did not. Flying was not something the war had given him. It was something he had brought to the war. The conflict had tested it, refined it, nearly taken it from him. But it had not changed its fundamental nature. He returned to aviation, not as a combat pilot. That war was over. As a test pilot. The post-war period saw an explosion of experimental aircraft development, jet propulsion, supersonic flight, new aerodynamic configurations that pushed against boundaries no one had crossed. Hoover became part of that world. He joined North American Aviation as a test pilot. He worked alongside men like Chuck Yeager, who would break the sound barrier in 1947. He flew aircraft at the edges of their performance envelopes, gathering data that engineers needed to push further. The skills that had kept him alive in combat, the precise control, the spatial awareness, the ability to think clearly when everything was going wrong, translated directly to test work. Every flight was a controlled exploration of the unknown. Every landing was a data point. He flew the F-86 Sabre, the aircraft that would dominate Korean War skies. He flew experimental prototypes that never reached production. He accumulated experience in dozens of aircraft types, building a catalog of knowledge that made him one of the most versatile pilots in American aviation. And then he found his true calling: air shows. The precision aerobatic demonstration became Hoover's signature. He developed routines that showcased aircraft capabilities through maneuvers that appeared impossible but were, in fact, the product of absolute control. Energy management, exact timing, the exploitation of every performance margin an aircraft possessed. His signature act was performed in a twin-engine Shrike Commander. He would shut down both engines, then execute a complete aerobatic sequence, loops, rolls, precision maneuvers, using only the aircraft's stored energy. No power, pure flight. It was not a trick. It was physics made visible. The same skills that had allowed him to escape in an unfamiliar enemy fighter, the ability to feel an aircraft's energy state, to know exactly what it could do, were now displayed for civilian crowds who could not fully understand what they were watching. Hoover performed at air shows for decades. He became a living legend in aviation circles. Other pilots studied his techniques. His name became synonymous with precision and control. He received honors, awards, recognition from military and civilian aviation institutions. He was consulted by NASA, by manufacturers, by anyone who needed to understand what an aircraft could actually do when flown by someone who had mastered the art. But he did not become a celebrity in the conventional sense. He did not write memoirs full of heroic self-promotion. He did not make television appearances trading on his war record. He did not transform himself into a professional hero. He flew, he taught, he demonstrated. He showed, through action rather than words, what was possible when a human being dedicated themselves completely to understanding a machine and working with it rather than against it. The escape from Stalag Luft I was a story he told rarely and reluctantly. When asked, he provided facts without embellishment. He did not dramatize. He did not inflate. He described what happened as a sequence of decisions made under pressure, nothing more. This restraint itself was the lesson. The men who become legends in aviation are not usually the ones who seek the spotlight. They are the ones who seek the sky. The recognition comes afterward, almost as an afterthought, because the work itself was the point. Robert Hoover lived into the 21st century. He died on October 25, 2016, at the age of 94. He had flown until his late 80s, when medical bureaucracy finally grounded him against his will, a battle he fought with the same persistence he had shown behind German wire. His legacy exists in the pilots who studied his techniques, in the air show performers who cite him as their inspiration, in the test pilot culture that values precision over bravado, in the simple understanding that a human being, properly trained and properly focused, can do things that appear impossible. The Germans captured him once. They assumed his war was over. They did not understand that a pilot without an aircraft is still a pilot. He was waiting for his moment, and when it came, he flew.